Hello, students. This is part one of the late 20th century and early 21st century America, which covers the time period of 1964 to the present. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on the civil rights movement. And I'm going to talk about an overview of the pictures and items and people on this page. You have Martin Luther King Jr., who's the leader of the civil rights movement. He's famous for his I Have a Dream speech given on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And then you have Betty Friedan. She was the leader and author of the women's rights movement in the early 1960s and 1970s. You have Lyndon Johnson, who was president who signed civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation. He was the vice president of John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated. Some pictures down here. You have a picture that's about the Brown versus Board of Education, which outlawed segregation in all public schools. Then you have the March on Washington, with these pictures right here. Then you have some technological advances that happen. You have internet, worldwide network, everybody's familiar with that. Satellite systems, which helped the telecommunications industry and the satellite industry. Equal rights for women were very important during this time period. And you have the cell phone, and you're familiar with that because all of you have cell phones, or most of you probably. And this page is here because I want to talk about some U.S. presidents that served their country in the late 20th century to the present. You're familiar with most of them. Right here is Lyndon B. Johnson. Then you have Richard Nixon. Then you have Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was the only president not to be elected to office. He took office because Richard Nixon resigned over the Watergate scandal. And this is Jimmy Carter. And you have Ronald Reagan, known as the Great Communicator. He was an actor turned politician. Then you have George H.W. Bush. He was the leader of the CIA at one time. Then you have Bill Clinton, who was a very popular president during this time period. He was impeached. And then you have George W. Bush. And he is known for presiding over the United States during the Iraq and Afghanistan war. He's also the president during the 9/11 attacks, terrorist attacks on New York City, and the attacks on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Here is familiar to many of you, or most of you, is Barack Obama, first African-American president, known for the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. And then you have the president and current president, Donald Trump. So here's a list of our presidents that served during the late 20th century into the present day. This page is about, it's going to start being about segregation and so the civil rights movement. And we learned that segregation means that you separate people based on race, color. It can also be by religion. And we learned that Jim Crow laws was the name for segregated laws, particularly in the South. You also had Jim Crow laws in the Midwest and parts of the Northeast. But it was primarily in the South. And segregation legalized discrimination. Is directed mostly towards African Americans in all aspects of life. It came to education, the political process, economic opportunities, day-to-day interactions with white people, public facilities, public accommodations. Those areas practice racial segregation, which legalized discrimination. We learned that discrimination means you treat people differently. And some effects of segregation: separate educational facilities and resources for white African American students. And you see that in these pictures right here. You have the the white elementary school, and you have the colored or black elementary school. And you notice the advantages and disadvantages between the two schools. And that's very apparent if you were to look at that. You have a wood stove and a colored school. It looks like it's a shack, not very well built. And in the white school, the desks are neat. Looks like the building is in good repair and good standing. Other aspects that were effects of segregation, you had separate public facilities, restrooms, drinking fountains, and restaurants. And that's apparent right here, this colored and white water fountain. And I've showed you this picture before. Right here it says Imperial Laundry Company, we wash for white only. So it legalized discrimination. And right here it says we want white tenants in our white community. So even certain communities that had housing developments in small neighborhoods discriminated against African Americans and told them that they couldn't live there just because of the color of their skin. And the last effect of segregation was social isolation of the races. Because of segregation, many African American people felt like they weren't worthy citizens, they weren't valuable. They even felt that they were inferior to whites, and they believed the notion that blacks were inferior, that mindset. It's like if people make fun of you and say that you're a bad person, that you're not a good person, you're going to believe that yourself. So it mentally and physically and socially isolated African Americans from the dominant society. So with those problems of segregation, you're going to need a change. You're going to need a movement called the Civil Rights Movement to fix the wrongs that segregation posed. On this page right here, it says Civil Rights Movement. It's a KWL chart. And this is a brainstorm that I would like for you to do in your notebook. The K column stands for what you know about the Civil Rights Movement. What do you know about the people who were during the Civil Rights Movement, why people participate in the Civil Rights Movement, and some things you might have prior knowledge of. Many people know about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks refusing to give her seat to a white passenger. The W is what you want to know. What are some questions that you would like to have answered and research about the Civil Rights Movement, or you would like to ask me? And L is what you've learned about the Civil Rights Movement after we finish talking about it. So please do this activity on somewhere in your notebook. Here are some events that are associated with the Civil Rights period. And if you have time, I would like for you to make an illustrative timeline with these events. It's not required, but it'll be extra credit if you do so. I'm going to touch base on these again and have you be made responsible for knowing this information. The Civil Rights Movement in the United States from 1954 to 1975. You also had aspects and events of civil rights before the 1950s. It didn't only start in 1954 and went to 1975. And you still have people fighting for civil rights today. Civil rights apply to everybody, regardless of race, color, religion, national origin, socioeconomic status, age. I think I said gender, male and female. And the Civil Rights Movement in the United States was primarily put together to improve the basic rights for women and minorities. Minorities are the smaller group in a society. The first event that's really important in the Civil Rights Movement in 1954 was the Brown versus Board of Education. That was a Supreme Court case that ruled that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional. And Virginia was one of the last states to integrate their public schools. My parents never went to integrated schools. Many of the schools in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, almost all the schools in Bedford County were segregated. Body Camp Elementary was a black school. Menita Elementary was a white school. So those are examples of segregated schools in Bedford County in their community that practice segregation. But that was outlawed by the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, 1954. 1955 was the Montgomery bus boycott that was sparked by Rosa Parks. She was a seamstress and it led to the desegregation of transit bus systems in Montgomery, Alabama, all across the South. And black residents refused to ride buses, which had an economic cost to the city of Montgomery. And we know that African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus. There was a partition. White people sat up front, black people sat in the back. Now, the bus was full, and a white person got on the bus. The African American would have to stand up. Even though if they were in the black section, they would have to, the black person would have to give up their seat. And Rosa Parks said, "I'm not going to do that." So segregation was not fair. In 1960, the Greensboro lunch counter sit-in for African American students of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University sat at a whites-only lunch counter inside of Greensboro, North Carolina Woolworth store. That's a mouthful to say. And we're going to read a play about those brave 4 African American students who broke the law to make things right, to make things better for everybody. 1963, the March on Washington, 200,000 American citizens, from celebrities, public officials, religious leaders, and musicians, led the biggest demonstration for equal rights. The highlight of this march was Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and he called for passive resistance and nonviolent protest against racism, segregation, and discrimination against blacks. And that word passive resistance means that you resist without being violent, without being physical. And your goal is to hopefully win over the hearts and minds of people that things need to be changed to make everybody treated fairly and treated equally. Many people died. Many people went to jail because they went against Jim Crow laws that were racist and discriminatory. Black and white people fought together to make our country great and make our country equal. And that fight continues to this day. 1964, Civil Rights Act of 1964, that law ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It's considered one of the crowning achievements of the Civil Rights era. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. So that was what made the Civil Rights Act of 1964 very important. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act bans racial discrimination in voting practices by the federal government as well as by the state and local governments. So the federal government says that you can't discriminate against people at the federal level when they vote. It means the same thing in all the 50 states and all the cities and towns. Point blank. 1966, the founding of NOUN, which was a National Organization of Women. NOUN is dedicated to making legal, political, social, and economic change in our society in order to achieve our goal, which is to eliminate sexism and end all oppression. So that's an organization that fights for equality for women, women in the workforce, women in different jobs, women in the government, women everywhere across our country. And it gave a lot of hope for little girls that when they grow up, they're going to be treated equally and fair in every aspect of life. 1973, you had the AIM, Occupation Wounded Knee. We learned about the Wounded Knee massacre when we talked about westward expansion and its impact on Native American, like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Chief Joseph. So the Wounded Knee incident began on February the 27th, 1973, when approximately 200 Oglala Lakota and followers of the American Indian movement seized and occupied the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So Native Americans also fought for their equality and rights during the Civil Rights Movement. So this is part one of this presentation. Please feel free to listen to the information again to get a better understanding. Thanks for listening, and get ready for part two, and peace out.